If you're watching this, I can only assume you've already seen part 1 of Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. If you haven't, I'd recommend watching it before watching this video. This will spoil essentially the entire first part and a little bit of part 2 as well. At this point, it's common knowledge that Phantom Blood began releasing in 1987 to celebrate the 99th anniversary of the Communist Manifesto's publication. The title is a clever reference to the Crimson Spectre of communism that was establishing itself in the atmosphere around the time period that the story takes place, and this only becomes clearer as you progress. The story begins around the year that Das Kapital was written, with a working-class fellow discovering a buggy wreck on his journey home. Upon seeing a sharply dressed fellow face up in the mud, he removes a potentially dangerous ring to make sure he can get an accurate pulse. And upon realizing that the man may be deceased, he checks his belongings to see if he was carrying any identification. At this point, we discover that the dead man isn't actually dead. His name is George Joestar, and although slow on the draw, he seems to carry a wealthy tone. His savior is revealed to be one Vladio Brando. If we rearrange the letters of Dario's name, we get this. This. Yeah. Dario's given a special opportunity by Mr. Joestar, the opportunity for his offspring to reap the generational benefits he couldn't provide on his own. And it's at this moment that all the cards come together. The briefcase of the bourgeois flings open and a haunting mask flies across the screen, much like a phantom or a specter. Part 1, a tale of two people. 12 years after Dario's heroics, we're shown the outside of the Joestar compound, and what's this? He has a son? Oh, and his son's even wealthy enough to own a large dog. The son is shown to be sloppy and gross at the dinner table, which his father strongly opposes.
Don't feel so smart now, do you, Will?
Forgive me, Father.
The son apologizes to what seems like an empty husk of a father. In between shots of the wealthy child being teased, Dario gives his son Dio the fruits of his labor, a ticket into the upper crust of Victorian living. He saved it for his last breath, knowing that his end would spell the end for his old friend George as well. It's through this vector, Dio being entrusted to the Joestar family, that he begins his hero's journey. Dio's class consciousness, brought about by his time living amongst the dregs of Victorian England's lower and working class, combined with his superior intellect, makes him the living embodiment of Vladimir Lenin's vanguardist ideology. The juxtaposition of Jonathan and Dio shows the yin-yang of class convenience. Sometimes it's who you are, but sometimes it's who you know. Keep in mind, this is all the cold open. Sounds like we could all use a big belch to open up our guts and digest these mealy scenes.
I'll be fine.
Fine, yeah, let's move along then. Getting back to the story here, Dio's carriage pulls up to the Joestar compound and, Anyways, as George's son approaches Dio, his hound is shown to be exhibiting some strange behavior. We can see him in the background pacing in circles as if he were lost and confused. Much like the working class under capitalism, Jonathan's dog wanders aimlessly in circles in a dazed confusion, the illusion of progress when none has been made. And, just like the working class under capitalism, Jonathan cares little for the creature he views as beneath him, subservient to him. This may be why the hound is in such a poor state, exhibiting symptoms very common for animals suffering from rabies. Luckily, when the rabid hound tries to attack Dio, he holds frame and avoids any severe illness. Jonathan, who allows for his pets to be infected and untreated for a disease as serious as rabies, takes issue with Dio acknowledging that this behavior is unfamiliar. Does he do this out of concern for his pet, though? Of course not. Jonathan cares little for the health of his loyal companion. He is merely outraged that a member of the working class would dare touch his property, let alone defend himself. Jonathan carries this anger into all aspects of his new life with the far superior Dio living under his roof. Time and time again, trial after trial, Dio outperforms the impotent Jonathan in all manner of tasks. Education, table manners, even physical combat. Jonathan can't compare to the prowess and hard-earned talents that Dio possesses. For Jonathan, being bested by somebody he sees as beneath him is too much to bear. His sense of entitlement, brought about by his class position, is threatened and therefore he lashes out.
Whatever you're thinking, stop it!
Jonathan even sinks so low as to try and defame Dio after their pugilist display, attempting to convince the crowd that Dio purposefully jammed a thumb into his eye. It's made clear to the audience that this was merely an unfortunate accident, but for Jonathan, this is no excuse. After all, up to this point, he's lived as the boy king of the region, lording over those a humbler man would call his peers. When Dio threatens this hierarchy by being the first bold enough to strike at Jonathan, to strike an embodiment of power itself, he feels threatened and, dare I say, afraid. I posit that it's here, in this moment, that Jonathan sets to mind his plan to unravel Dio, and like any true capitalist, he gives not a single care to the cost.
A true gentleman has no thief.
Think about it. George lets his son travel outside the yard for what exactly? So he can feed his dog foods that would give him kidney failure? Unless you're trying to say that Irina is a dog poisoner, which she's not, it seems like you're trying to say that Danny's passing was an unexpected occurrence, which it wasn't. Jonathan blames Dio for this, but he needs to understand that correlation doesn't equal causality, and even if it did, maybe he should correlate his blasé attitude with feeding his dog hazardous foods being a potential cause. After all, which is more likely? Did Dio stuff a live Great Dane into a box, carry it across the yard, and put it into the incinerator without anybody noticing? Or did poor, sickly Danny, after years of eating food his body wasn't equipped for, succumb to his withering insides, crawl inside the box for comfort, only to be burned by mistake, all due to Jonathan's carelessness and inattention? I think we all know the answer. This misunderstanding is the foundation of the class struggle that the current system had continually milked for, at the time the series began, the past century at least. I mean, Marx did write about this 100 years ago, so capitalism or a similar cast of classes had probably been pretty annoying even back then. This is something that we'll definitely come back to. Much like the film Death Note, we're now supposed to begin our anxious engines and crank the RPMs to 11 as the cat and mouse game, get it, between two opposite people that share a living space begins. Will Dio be able to exonerate himself in the eyes of his cellmate?
Loneliness will devour a man from within.
A couple days later, they get into a brawl, but Dio wins, of course. After all, Lenin's revolutionary vanguard is the only way to overcome institutional power and influence, as represented by Jonathan, so it only follows that Dio would make quick work of this posh dandy. With the first shots of the battle for class liberation fired, we go to sleep for 7 years, and wake up in what seems like a dystopian nightmare hellscape version of our earlier setting. George has come down with a serious illness, not unlike Dio's father Dario. At this point, Jonathan is so far beyond the pale, he's begun to intentionally gaslight his own father in a fruitless attempt to place blame on Dio for administering poison to him. From the audience's perspective, we know that this is once again a case of Jonathan seeing, but not believing. George knows it's very hard to request doctor-assisted euthanasia in the time and place that they live. Having Dio procure and administer disguised poison grants George a sense of control over his own mortality when he knows he's reaching the limit of existence. Dio was the one person George could confide in about this task, and some of you already know that the embarrassment of Jonathan finding out would spell his end regardless. So, as though he was tasked to do so by anyone, Jonathan sets off for the big city in order to track down the creator of this poison and prove once and for all that the working class cannot be trusted. And who better to speak for the untrustworthiness of the working class than a Part 2, Class Traitors. Now, if you're looking for a real rough cutter, I can't point in a more obvious direction than here. This piece of work, who goes by the name Robert E.O. Speedwagon, goes from defending his home street to polishing Jonathan's boots with his own mouth in 2 minutes flat. Sure, you could say that Robert was simply praising the non-aggression principle, and I'll give you that, it is likely. What's more likely is Rio saw an opportunity to heighten his own socioeconomic standing by stepping on others. Jojo's creator, Hirohiko Araki, has gone on to say, yeah, that might not be a real quote, but the point still stands. So after Jonathan returns home from buying the poison he planned to plant on Dio in a misguided attempt to turn George against him, George comes to the realization that Jonathan's meddling will prevent him from experiencing a much less painful death, considering the state of medicine in the era. Dio grants George's wish with advanced, expedited shipping before Jonathan attempts to kill him and cover it up by being suicide by cop. Luckily, Dio had something that would get him out of this, or whatever. Because he no longer had any footing to take Dio down over the death of his father, Jonathan sets his own house ablaze to at least collect on insurance. Remember, to this person, everything is a transaction.
Jojo bested the home which burned around him!
He sleeps it off before going on a revenge quest to murder Dio, who had already moved on at this point. As Jonathan, Irina, and Rio leave the Joestar compound, a well-dressed stranger enters. Baron Zeppeli is a master of something called Ripplehammer and teaches it to a naturally skilled Jonathan. It's explained as a cure-all for people like Dio, something that Jonathan can utilize as easy as taking a breath. Think about it. What could this interaction possibly be alluding to? Finance. Business. Part 3. Hammond. Have you ever wondered how some ultra-wealthy individuals make money faster than they could ever spend it? Is it due to intense amounts of labor combined with certifications out the wazoo? If you answered yes, you may be a fan of the character Robert E.O. Speedwagon, but the real answer is the same as the answer to the following question. Did Jonathan Joestar become rich with Ripplehammer because he spent years training? The answer is no. Baron Zeppeli is, in essence, a ham-on hedge fund manager. He seeks out those with a gift that they already have and provides a service to help that gift grow. Whether that gift is inherited wealth, exploited wealth, or Hammond, these can all be managed by an outside party to ensure that it will compound into a powerful tool for the rich. When the Baron demonstrated his abilities by breaking a rock, Araki was implying that Zeppeli's true nature was to exploit the labor of the frog while taking credit for the outcome. Hammond and wealth are utilized with as much effort as breathing, and boy does Jonathan know how to breathe. If we could frame Jonathan through someone in a similar class and with a similar demeanor, Wyatt Koch is almost a perfect analog. Wyatt is the son of one of the famous Koch brothers, who have spent years growing their wealth for use in prolonging the suffering of the working class. Wyatt breaks from this tradition by starting his own company that creates beautiful shirts. Without the wealth he inherited and without the help of a financial advisor, Wyatt would not be able to breathe out these vibrant designs. The same can be said for Jonathan, someone coming hot off the inheritance press with wealth as vast and vague as the Joestar fortune, and his newfound Hammond power. After an intense afternoon of breathing in and out, Zeppeli latches on to Jonathan's entourage and begins to demonstrate the most efficient methods to destroy those that may rise against him. With the non-aggression principle thrown to the wayside, Jonathan blows the head clean off a man without spilling a drop of wine.
Passes through the glass, my arm, my body, the ground itself. My spirit trembles, my heart is ablaze. I found you, zombie!
Sounds like you passed the test with flying colors, Jojo.
They quickly catch up to Dio and discover that he has been influencing an entire town with his revolutionary ideology. Part 4. Ending a Workers' Revolution. I can tell you want to get to the meatier bits of the video, so I'm going to wrap up the plot as quickly as I can here. It shouldn't take too long. Fair warning, the story does become pretty lazy and paint by numbers, but honestly, what can you do when the whole story revolves around an antagonist? It's like the Joker movie in that way, but without the face paint. And it probably differs in other ways, but I'd have to see the movie before I try to compare them. Anyways, the Joestar trio confronts Dio unsuccessfully, and Dio summons two historical figures that have a backstory, named Tarukas and Brufford. The two share a storied history, one mired in political intrigue, devotion, and betrayal. In their former lives, the pair served as guardians of the ruling class. At least, that's how their social equals would have referred to them. To their superiors, they were just glorified hound dogs, happy to live off the table scraps thrown their way and eager to please their masters. To the proletariat, they were the tip of the authoritarian sword, the harbingers of death and oppression, and the cudgel of the state. It should come as no surprise that once their usefulness had been exhausted, they were put down like the dogs they were. This background makes their resurrection all the more poetic. Dio, always flourishing his sharp and refined mind even in the face of revolutionary conflict, can't help but twist this historical pair in a way to amuse himself, and to amuse us, the audience. Once serving the monarchy, the very pinnacle of unearned, inherited wealth and power, the two now take on a new role as the tip of the spear in Dio's thrust against institutional power. It should then also come as no surprise that Jonathan, who we know has a checkered past when it comes to caring for or even about dogs, reacts to their plight by blowing off Brufford's arm and executing him for a second time. They then escape from Tarukis by utilizing Hammond power, bunching up some leaves. This is obviously a reference to the safety parachute that cash can become for people like the Joestars and Zeppelis. It guides them to a large mansion, which I believe they were going to claim as their own. It's at this moment that Tarukis steps in and comes closer to resolving the story's conflict than even Dio had at that point. Unfortunately, this falls apart. The hedge fund manager inserts himself into the conflict in what appears to be a suicidal act. He waxes on about how he wanted to die with his lips on the footwear of his client. Tarukis seems to grant his wish with similarly advanced expedited shipping as what George had received, but it's made unclear whether this was actually his doing or if Zeppeli had taken his own life to lionize himself in Jonathan's eyes. After all, it's important to remember that Zeppeli, like all hedge fund managers, isn't fully a member of the bourgeoisie. He occupies a more nebulous space between petty bourgeois and full-on bourgeois, dependent on the wealth and validation of the ruling class, but poised in a far more elevated position to the masses beneath him. Without Jonathan's approval and patronage, Zeppeli loses all authority, meaning, and influence. Regardless of who took out the Hammond hedger, Jonathan got his confidence boost and executed the other guard. Again. From here they meet up with the other hedge fund managers, all from within Zeppeli's firm, who pledge allegiance to Jonathan without having met him prior. This should not be surprising at this point. Like the old adage goes, birds of a parasitic feather flock together. Zeppeli, a company man up until his last breath, clearly sacrificed his own life knowing that this would put his partners in an advantageous market position. Now, with double their previous numbers, they finally have the power necessary to forcefully unseat Dio from his position of power. We see Dio with the fruits of his labor, an entire community of working-class individuals who find value in something other than the dollar. They convene under Dio not because he's a grifting dictator, a wolf in sheep's clothing if you will, but because his charisma is a guiding light in a time where darkness consumes the majority of day-to-day life. Working for scraps has taken a toll on this town's people. Dio, out of the kindness of his heart and the tuning of his moral compass, takes it upon himself to put in the effort needed to start a revolution of this scale. Even if one town is a drop in the ocean, he sets an example for how something like this can be realistically achieved. Obviously, once Jonathan realized what was happening, the pedal was pushed through the floor as he raced to stop this from spreading into his neighborhood. This directly parallels a time of historical significance for the working class. I'm talking, of course, about the October Revolution in Russia. In the year 1917, the workers and common folk of the Tsardom had enough of the abysmal conditions and oppressions, seizing power and setting the country on the path toward communist proliferation. Russia's neighbors in Europe and abroad, rather than allowing the people of Russia to self-determine, saw this people's revolution as a direct threat to their own internal hierarchies. If it could happen in Russia, it could happen anywhere. Much like Joestar and his band of merry fascists, the capitalist powers of the world united in opposition to the country that stood as a beacon of hope to the masses. Dio, similar to the Soviet Union, is forced into an ultimatum. Roll over and let the dream of the proletariat-led future die out with a flicker, or meet overwhelming hostility with hostility of your own. Had Jonathan just let sleeping Diogs lie, there's a strong likelihood that nothing would have ever happened to him. Much like their pugilist display all those years ago, the threat of losing power is the only factor guiding Jonathan's ideology. Once the two meet for the first time since George was euthanized, Dio puts up the best fight he could. Had this been a one-on-one match, the only fair way to settle this dispute, we have the background knowledge to know that Dio would have won. But because Jonathan threw as much money, Hammond, at the problem that he could, The coup on this sleepy town was a success. It's at this moment that I started to rage out in my apartment, violently throwing objects at other objects. I hadn't even talked about their exploitation of the one kid in this community that was suckered into believing he was fighting for the good guys. His name was Tonka or something, but yeah, sucker's born every minute, I suppose, dumb kid. Can you imagine if the story ended here, at the lowest, most depressing point possible? Luckily, I wasn't justified in my previous anger. I was just left with a feeling of regret. Not regret for ever doubting Dio's ambitions, mind you, no. Regret that I threw my Tobias Funke mug at my TV and had to wait for my accidental damage claim to settle before watching the last episode. It starts out with Jonathan and Irina getting on a boat, which I was hoping was the Titanic, but I don't think it was. No matter anyway, because as the ship is in the middle of the ocean, we see hints that the members of this ship are moving further and further left as the journey progresses. Who else could convince a boat full of wealthy socialites that their class is the problem other than Dio himself? He sustains some damage in his battle with Jonathan, but he somehow lives on. Although he's represented in this episode as a disembodied head, his existence at this point is not literal, but metaphorical. The head of Dio on this ship represents the specter of communism that will never die. It's kind of like the Hydra from Hercules, but instead of heads replacing heads, it's revolution replacing revolution. Right after Jonathan sets the entire boat ablaze in a fiery explosion, Dio is finally able to end his reign of terror. In an act of true poetic justice, he decapitates Jonathan, off-screen of course, and goes down with the ship. A spoiler for part 2 is coming up. Jonathan impregnated Irina before killing everyone on the boat. Because she was the only one who escaped, suspiciously, we have to live with that bittersweet ending. Yes, Jonathan is no longer able to use his wealth to upend leftist revolts, but much like Zeppeli, he is now lionized in the eyes of the one person who survived the explosion. Nobody else will know who Jonathan really was. A cold, callous man who would rather blow up dozens of people than see them side with the working class. Except for us. Okay, it sounds like we could all use a big belch to open up our guts and digest these mealy scenes. Well, I don't hear any objections, so let's start breaking everything down character by character.